we're going to switch gears a little bit. And so in the first block, we established the problem, right? One of the problems anyways, the problem of the user. Now, as an organization, how are we going to go about kind of assessing the risk caused by users, caused by others, but how are we assessing that risk, and what are some of the things that we're going to do about it, right? So how are we going to influence our decision-making when we ultimately do those sorts of things? So we saw definitions before of what was risk, what was a threat, what was vulnerability. I'm adding to this whole conversation the whole idea of the impact or the cost, right? So if there is an exploited vulnerability, it results in some sort of a cost, right? If every single one of LastPass passwords were compromised, there was a cost to LastPass when that happened. And so what is that? What is the cost? And that's going to help us understand how much are we willing to invest in preventing that from happening, right? So if I told you that there's a vulnerability that could be exploited and it would cost the organization $100, how much should the organization be willing to invest in preventing that from happening? Yeah. Less than $100. Thank you. We don't know what the exact number is, right? If I said you can spend $99 to avoid $100 risk, some of us might say, you know what, that $1 savings isn't worth it, right? Small numbers, very, very simple. Oftentimes these decisions are not made in regards to really small numbers, right? We would multiply that by an order of magnitude. We'd be talking hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in what these look like. A lot of what we're going to talk about, we're going to keep the numbers small because I think for most of us, it's easier to do math and make decisions when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars instead of talking about millions and billions of dollars. But the concepts are the same. So, James, did you get everyone a worksheet? James over here. All right, James disappeared. I asked him to do some work for me. I get a couple volunteers to hand out these worksheets for me. All right, can you see the people on that side of the room get them? I have a hand over here. Someone over here want to help me out? All right, make sure everybody gets one of these, and I'm going to switch screens, and we're going to do some homework together. All right, if you are online, you should have been emailed a copy of this worksheet last night. If not, I believe there is a website somewhere where this is posted. Right. So what we want to do is we think about risk and the whole idea of what it's going to cost us is think about a couple of terms. The first one is the idea of a single loss expectancy. If there is a loss,
does anyone not have one?
What does it happen if it happens one time? And then from that, how many times do we think that's going to happen throughout the course of the year? And then I multiply those two numbers, and I get what's called the annual loss expectancy, which is how much I would expect to lose over the course of a year. So in this document, we have a scenario spelled out that lets us begin to capture some of this information. And looking at that scenario, what is the single loss expectancy to Richmond Investments? Yeah, $500. So if we lose one smartphone, it costs us $500, right? The value of each smartphone is $500. So I'm going to put that number right there under single loss expectancy. All right. How many times are we expecting that we will lose a smartphone, have it damaged, have it broken over the course of the year? How many times throughout the year is this going to happen?
75.
75. All right. Right. It's pretty easy in these scenarios, right? In the past year, they've lost or damaged 75. So that's a good number to say. Last year, we lost 75. This year, let's start with that as our baseline. Okay. So ultimately, how much money do we lose every year because of people losing their phones?
37,500.
37,500, right? We have to do math. 37,500. Oftentimes, when I'm getting more complicated than this and just doing a simple worksheet, Microsoft Excel is great for these sorts of things. And what organizations will do actually is they'll create what is called a risk register, where for their different assets, they will do these sorts of things for all the various different assets to keep track of, well, what happens when that asset's lost? How many times would it happen? What happens when we're breached? There's all sorts of different things that could happen to an organization. We need to keep track and know what it would cost. So that way when we say we've got a budget to spend, we can begin to know where should we invest that budget, because money doesn't grow on trees. And as much as the security manager would like to invest in every security solution, there's a limit on where that money can be spent. All right, so if we keep reading down, we've got these basic numbers here. What are my options here if I'm Richmond? So Richmond is considering buying insurance, right? So what does insurance do? Let's first talk about what does insurance do?
Insurance pays out if you end up losing money to some.
Right, let's talk about car insurance. How many of you have car insurance? Why do you have car insurance? Yes, I have to, but tell me I have to. Why? Why? Need it for what?
If you're in an accident like that, you can't pay off right then.
Right, so let's assume for a minute that you drive a $50,000 car. And so does the other person that you get in an accident with. They drive a $50,000 car. You still owe your bank $40,000 for a $50,000 car, and that other person has a $50,000 car. So if you get into an accident and you crash, and we're not talking about hospital bills or anything, two $50,000 cars run into each other, all of a sudden, the $40,000 I owe my bank plus $50,000, $90,000 needs to be created. How many of you at this very moment could write a check for $90,000 to take care of that? I can't, right? I'm pretty sure most of us can't. So insurance comes into place, right? And insurance says, okay, you will pay a deductible, but then we'll cover the rest. What is the purpose of a deductible? Yeah.
Stop a bunch of like really small claims.
Okay, it'll stop really small claims. That's part of it. Why else are there deductibles?
Mainly so the insurance doesn't have to pay as much.
Well, that's part of it. It actually affects behavior. How many of you heard the concept of having skin in the game? Right? The deductible ensures you have skin in the game, so you are making a decision that still affects you. So let's assume that you have a $1,000 deductible on your car insurance. If you had a $0 deductible, right, we'd have these small claims. How many of you have seen the Mayhem commercials with State Farm or Progressive or whatever they are? Where the person is going through the parking lot and just doesn't care and is hitting all the cars, right? When mayhem happens, we're here to help, right? Selling the whole idea of car insurance. If there is a $0 deductible, we may actually not take any ownership of our behavior when we're driving the car. Because we'll be like, you know what, if something happens, the insurance company will just take care of it for me and we'll be good. The idea of the deductible is, you know what, that $1,000 deductible, I don't want to pay that, right? Even $1,000, I could come up with it, I could write that check, would be all right, but it would still suck, right? I'd rather keep that $1,000 and not, give it to, fix someone else's car, right? So it keeps some skin in the game. So in this scenario, we see that we can pay a premium, the $25,000. We can get insurance, so if something happens, the device is replaced. But there's ultimately a deductible, and the deductible here is captured to the whole idea that 5 becomes the annual rate, right? We have to replace 5 of them before insurance kicks in, right? So the first 5 we paid for. After that, they're going to pay for the rest of it. That's the idea of a deductible in this scenario. So with that information, what is our current ALE? We've got that from before, right? With this new control in place with the insurance, we are responsible, our deductible, for the first 5 phones that gets lost. After that, they're going to take on responsibility. So that way we don't just say to our employees, hey, go willy-nilly, lose your phone, we don't care. So we need to have some sort of as an organization in this case, some care about what people do. And then what is the annual loss expectancy then if we buy this insurance? What?
Still 75.
The annual loss expectancy.
So if the ARO is 5, then it's going to be ALA equals to 2,500.
Okay, 2,500. So what we got 500 times 5, right? So we still, for a single loss, is still 500, but we could lose 5 with this control. So we take that 500 times 5 and we get 2,500. Okay, and so what are our savings then? So if we take our current ALE of 37,500 and we subtract that 2,500, by making this investment, we would save our organization $35,000. But in order to save $35,000, we have to spend $25,000. So that makes the realized savings what? So $10,000. So we're ultimately going to come out ahead on this investment. Do we do it? How many say yes? Every hand raised. How many say no? How many of you say maybe? I say maybe. Why would I say maybe? Okay, those who said yes. Why did you say yes? Let's start there.
The expected value is $10,000 of realized savings.
All right, so we save money. We come out ahead. Therefore, absolutely, I'm going to do it. Yeah.
Yes, because it's close to a quarter of what the expected.
Right, so that ratio is pretty darn good. So it seems like a pretty good investment from that perspective.
But you could also say maybe because we only have one data point from a single year, and so it was just a really bad year. And
So 75 might be an anomaly. The year before it may have been 25. Yeah. Oh, and what are the terms? So there might be some terms we want to look at. Let's assume they would just create a replacement would be whole. And you'd probably do it. So is this the only decision I am making when it comes to investing my security dollars?
There's also an alternative or possible alternative form of insurance that you can consider.
There might be other forms of insurance, but let me suggest this. What if we also have a web server where we store 10 million customer records, and there is an opportunity to invest the same amount of money that would save us $100,000. And this $25,000 investment is the only security investment I can make. Do I invest on smartphones, or do I invest on that database server that's going to have so much more payoff? Right? So this is one data point, right, for one particular investment. What ultimately happens is we have to decide as an organization which of many options we're going to invest in. So a calculation like this, we're going to do for many different opportunities of what we could invest in from an organization to improve our security stance. And ultimately, we will invest in the ones that give us the most bang for our buck. To make this even more complicated, and just to give you a taste of this, and I'm not doing it here because I spent a whole week in class getting to this point, but what if one investment actually affects 5 different resources, and we can accumulate savings because of an investment that, you know, a firewall is going to provide protections to all sorts of things. So you can actually get some fairly complicated calculus here of where is that best thing to invest in and where am I going to get the best bang for that buck. But the process is the same. What is that single loss expectancy? If one time that thing happens, we lose one record, we lose one whatever. How many times is that going to happen each year? And then what does it cost to invest? And how does it change what our ultimate loss is going to be? We can make an informed investment decision. Why is it important to think about things this way? Who makes the decision of where organizations spend money or how much money they can spend on things? Where does that ultimately come from? Yes. Might come from the CFO. I would say it comes from the corporate suite somewhere, right? At the end of the day, right? They set the budget. They say this year you have this much money to spend. Okay, so let's think about operations for a minute. Let's assume that we're a manufacturing company and we make sleeves for coffee cups. And I want to buy a new machine that would make these twice as many in an hour, so we can double our output without having to buy any more warehouse space. And we'll have twice as many to be able to sell and be able to make more money. Am I going to be able to quantify a return on investment for making that machine? Am I going to know that if I make more of those and I sell more of those, I'm going to make more money? Probably, right? You can actually. If I normally make 1,000 of these, now I'm making 2,000 of these, I'm going to sell twice as many. It costs me a certain amount of money to make twice as much money. How many years until that pays for itself? I came up with a formula that says that's a great investment. It's going to pay for itself in 6 months, or it's a terrible investment. It's going to take 20 years to pay for the fact that we doubled the amount of sleeves we're going to make. Let's turn that thinking a minute. If you invest in cybersecurity, what happens? If we're good and we make right decisions, nothing happens. How do you quantify the fact that nothing's going to happen?
Quantify it by the loss that didn't happen.
But how do we know what the loss is that didn't happen?
You can consider losses from previous years. You can consider losses in similar organizations.
So it's information we can bring in, but we don't have absolute numbers, right? So one of the things that can happen, and I've seen this happen, where it's like, you know what? Over the last 3 years, we've reinvested in buying such and such software, and we have seen no breaches over those 3 years. Maybe we can invest less because we actually haven't recognized the fact that there were costs. So you have to have good, solid data from other places that says, if we didn't have this, here's what might have happened, right? So the world of security, you're talking about what is the cost savings for things that did not happen. Which, when you're in the world of arguing about, do we invest in selling more of the things that we make? What we exist as an organization to do is to make this thing, versus do we invest in a security decision so we prevent things from happening? So the whole idea of these numbers, they should be well researched, right? Well grounded and well supported, so we can demonstrate to people who are making broad range decisions to what the organization is going to invest in, that the investment of what we're doing in cybersecurity is important. Thankfully, one thing that's happening in organizations is more people that have a security background are making their way onto corporate boards, right, into the C-suite, or even on the board of directors, which is helping to be able to make this argument. 10 years ago, this argument was a lot harder because you had people who did not understand this world of cybersecurity at all. But it goes to the importance of being able to quantify what it is that we're ultimately going to invest in. All right, questions about that? Yeah.
Just a practical question. How much, in your experience or what you know, how much does it cost to move a company to have cybersecurity?
I can make up a number right to make it up. But it depends on the organization, right? It depends on what they're in and what their risk exposure is. And you know, a company that is straight up in the data space, like a company like Amazon, I guarantee they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on security, right? They have to. If it is, you know, 100, you know, person manufacturing operation out of Spokane, Washington, they're probably spending a lot less because they're smaller and they don't have the budget. So it depends absolutely on the organization. And yeah, I was talking with an organization recently of about 1,000 people, that had recently been dealing with a data breach, and they have nobody solely dedicated to the world of security. For them, they don't have the resources to have even a single person who is dedicated to that. They have 3 IT managers who all have to bear some responsibility for making those decisions, but as part of the overall thing that they do, they wear, tons of hats. It's interesting, some of the stuff I've learned on their process. I can't share it all, but it was very interesting to me to begin to look into the, you think about the Microsofts of the world, and they just have so much staff dedicated to so many different things. But if you're not, a Fortune 500 company, you're probably playing with a much smaller budget. So, okay. All right. All right. So, going through this risk process, or going through that process of quantifying the risk is part of the risk management process of what we're going to do to figure out what are we dealing with. So right here, this is that risk assessment, right? We identified what are the risks. We're going to do this for multiple different items. We're going to evaluate them, what's the impact, and then what are we going to invest in? What are the risk reducing measures? And we're going to invest in them. We're going to say, yay, we got it, right? Once we've made that decision, we implement it, right? So we're either going to, in the case of insurance, we're going to transfer that risk. Our decision might be to avoid the risk. How would we avoid a risk? What decisions can we make that would result in avoiding risk? Okay, like what? Let's talk about 2 terms: risk avoidance and risk mitigation. So avoid means avoid, where we're not going to see the risk. Mitigate means we're going to do some things to reduce that risk. Right? So we talked about, from the availability perspective, that some organizations turn off their internet or their access to things during certain times of the day, right? Nobody should be accessing it between 8 and 5. We've decided we're going to avoid the risk of someone in another time zone that it happens to be their working hours getting our access to our information. Flat out avoid it by taking things offline. Whereas risk mitigation may be, we're going to put in intrusion detection systems. We're going to put in these firewalls that are going to recognize things. So that way we're going to be much more likely to catch it. Does it reduce it down to 0? No, but it gets it closer.
Well, avoidance in the, pulling it off the internet except during between 8 and 5 still also doesn't reduce it down to 0, but it's reducing probabilities.
Sure, we avoid it during that window, but it reduces greatly the probabilities. There's other things where we may say, we don't even need to store that information. So we're not going to have the risk of it being stolen because we decided we're straight up not going to store that anymore. So we can make decisions like that too. Risk acceptance, we may say, there's a level of risk that we are never going to be able to avoid, and we're going to just accept it and be good with it. Could be a decision that we make. Transference, the idea of insurance. Then we're going to keep evaluating these risks. We put these things in place, and the world doesn't stand still, right? So we need to continue to evaluate and ensure that these things are working. And as we notice that, regulations have changed, or in evaluating what's going on, something's different, we update our risk registry, right? That math that we did, we update it because the world has changed at some level. And so we're always paying attention to this process. So oftentimes in an organization, you'll have teams, and their job is to pay attention to these risk numbers, right? So that way we have the ability to make informed decisions of what should we be doing to address these issues. Or we talked about social engineering and what ChatGPT is potentially doing to the ability to do targeted spear phishing attacks, right? Has the math changed? Maybe it has, right? Are there new things that we could be looking at doing? We need to be having those conversations and figuring out where do we invest and where do we deal with things. So a couple of tools that an organization may very well have in place to help with this is One thing is called a business impact analysis. The other is a business continuity plan, and the other is a disaster recovery plan. So a business impact analysis. This is the whole idea that if something happens, what impact does that have on my business? So if you are WSU and it is December 1st, right after everyone's come back from Thanksgiving, and we get 2 feet of snow overnight, what's the impact on WSU and their ability to do their job when that happens?
Getting 2 feet of snow overnight,
Yeah.
on the roads.
Okay, got to plow the road.
Yeah, transportation.
Transportation, we got to get people here. Are we going to be able to deal with getting people on campus and safe if we get 2 feet of snow overnight? So WSU has a process. They've actually done this analysis, and they have somebody who makes a go, no go call. Do we actually have in-person classes? Because they've already done this business impact analysis and said, you know what, if the roads are that bad, if things are that bad, you know what, we're going to have a process, and we know who the person is who's going to make the call that says, we're not going to have class. Okay, let's back up a little bit to something that we went through. And I got to be part of this process because I became department chair on April 1st, 2020. What was happening at WSU in about April 1st, 2020? COVID. How many of you were part of the rules were changing every time you open a new email from WSU? Okay, so business impact analysis. There is a worldwide pandemic, and it's not safe for us to have in-person classes. Therefore, we're going to teach the rest of the semester at home. Do you think WSU had done a business impact analysis to say, what do we do if we can't teach in person at WSU?
The fact that you were able to end up with that kind of a plan makes me think someone thought that up.
To be honest, it was being made up as we went. Yeah, it was not a pre-planned, we're pivoting to Zoom because we know how to pivot to Zoom. And this was true across much of society. I don't think anybody had done this. I would say this actually goes into the area of disaster recovery planning. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But there was this big impact, and we hadn't completely played out that war game, right, to know exactly what would happen when we made these pivots. And we didn't have complete information, and nobody knew what was going on. And even, if you were signing a lease in the summer of 2020 in Pullman, and WSU actually told you like the Monday after you all had to sign leases that you weren't coming back for the whole year, talk about an upset consumer base of students that said, I've already committed to live in Pullman for the next year, and now you're saying I can go home and live in my parents' basement? To be honest, everybody at WSU thought, okay, we're going to get through the summer, life's going to be good, and then the next wave hit. And I mean, it was terribly unpredictable, and it affected not only WSU, but think about it. If you were an apartment owner in Pullman, Washington, and you have a loan to pay for your apartment complex, and WSU is sitting here thinking, are we going to have the students come back, or are we not? Was the planning of the apartment complexes in place to know what is the impact of these sorts of decisions on our ability to be a going concern to pay and keep our employees paid, restaurants. And okay, let's talk about one of my favorite examples, Peloton. How many of you are Peloton? Peloton is the bike company, right? Sell you a bike, I have one in my garage, right? And you get, streaming classes, and you get someone to yell at you and tell you to pedal harder, pedal faster, all that good stuff. Peloton blew up huge during the pandemic. Why?
We're at home and Peloton sells.
Not only were they at home, but where were they not allowed to go? Couldn't go to the gym. So all these people were like, I'm at home, I still need to exercise. I can have my exercise classes in my garage. How great. So Peloton invested all of this money thinking this is the new way of the world, right? The impact was great for them. Their stock prices went through the roof. Everybody was getting a subscription. We're getting the bikes. We're getting the treadmills. Then we get to 2022. What happens? Everyone's going back to work and they say, you know what? I hate exercising in my garage. I don't need to do this thing anymore. And Peloton had built capacity as an organization based on the business impact, not realizing that it wasn't going to be sunshine and roses forever. And then the stock market goes down and there's real concern of whether or not Peloton's going to ultimately, a year from now, still be a going concern. Because their business impact analysis was wrong. They thought growth was going to continue forever, and in reality, it didn't. We're seeing similar sorts of things for other online companies, right? Their ability to make money is based on making good decisions, and as the world changes, things might be different. So they need to do a business impact analysis somewhat regularly to see how will changes in the world affect their ability to do business. From a small scale, they'll ultimately then create what's called a business continuity plan. Excuse me, given these changes, what are we going to do if it snows? Well, use a different example of WSU. What if we have an extreme heat wave and the power goes out? We don't have enough power to power WSU and the power goes out and everything shuts down. What does WSU do to make sure they can still do what WSU exists to do? Well, maybe they invest in diesel generators of some sort so those can kick on to keep things running. Does everything at WSU need to have power at all times, or are there certain areas that are more important to have power, right? If the power goes off, what do we do? What if you're Amazon and your website goes down?
Well, we're kind of screwed.
Right? So for them, it's a big deal. And they should have a plan to say, all right, instead of us having to make it up as we go, what are the steps we're going to take to get this thing back on, right? So they could identify what are the different ways their website could potentially go down. And instead of having to try to dream it all up, they've thought about it in advance. And so that's really what we're trying to do when it comes to this sort of planning, is we want to think about what happens when something bad happens. And what do we need to do to get back to the place where we can do what we do as an organization? And the larger scale version of that is what's known as a disaster recovery plan. So how many of you remember, oh wow, well, this is 3 or 4 years ago, when Houston had 51 inches of rain fall down on it in a matter of about 3 days? You guys remember that tornado or whatever that came and just hung out over Houston and it just rained? Okay, what exists in Houston? Anyone know why this is an interesting business conversation?
NASA.
Okay, NASA's there, but there's more things there from a Fortune 500 company perspective. Oil companies. Most of the headquarters for oil companies are actually in Houston. Exxon, Mobil, all those sorts of companies, and several others. Okay, so if your location of your headquarters gets 51 inches of rain, I would call that a disaster, right? It's no longer just a minimal website was taken down sort of thing. This is large scale. What do we do? How many of you want to think about what do you do in the moment that things are hitting the fan? Right? With a disaster recovery plan in place, they say, okay, this is a disaster. Here's what our process is. Here is what we're going to do when disaster strikes. First thing is, let's make sure our people are taken care of, right? If there's people who are, potentially at risk of their lives being lost because of this disaster, let's make the decisions that's going to save lives. And then from that, what are the mission critical things that we really need to be taking care of? What are we going to do about it? And so on down the list. And if you have a checklist you can follow, you're much more likely to get it right than if you just make it up as you go along. So as we put these things together, a couple of things are going to come into place to inform our decision making. One is a recovery point objective. The whole idea here is, what is it from a data perspective, at what point do we need to get back to? For some people, losing a day's worth of data may be okay. Other people's like, you know what? We need to get back to the very second of where we were at before this whole thing happened. That's going to affect investments in your backup procedures, right? It's going to affect how you put together RAID arrays, various different things. At what point should we be in place? What are we going to do to that? Recovery time objective. How long on these different issues do we have to actually get recovered? If our business is straight up being driven by a website that has sales, well, getting that website back in place so we can make sure those sales orders can come in might have a shorter recovery time objective than, say, all the PCs that our employees are working at, that maybe that could take longer to get those things back in place, right? So depending on what the thing is, what we do as an organization, we're going to define these. From a business perspective, what do we need to do? And then from a technical perspective, what do we need to do to recover? We can define this up front. When it comes to decision-making time, we ultimately will get it right or be more apt to get it right. When it comes to a disaster recovery plan, we're gonna do a couple of things. We'll talk about this slide over here in a second. A threat analysis, right? This is much like the risk analysis we've done before, is identifying what are the disasters that could happen, what's the likelihood that they're going to happen, and ultimately, what is the impact that they're going to have. Oftentimes, these are played out with scenarios, like use cases that say, if this happens, let's kind of brainstorm ultimately what's going to happen. Then we document the heck out of it. So we have all the steps and we, have this stored somewhere. Where should those documents be stored to recover with? Where should we keep those? Who should have them? If I'm headquartered in Houston, Texas, do I have a binder and I stick it on the shelf and I'm all like, if we need it, I'm going to pull it off the shelf and I'm going to use it?
That's one way to do it, because if it's a bad enough disaster, you might not be able to access it remotely.
Well, we may not be able to access the internet, but we may not pull off the shelf probably good thing, so we should have a copy there. But you alluded to where else it should be.
Well, you also would want it.
We'll probably want an online version of it, so if we can't get to that bookshelf, we can pull it off of the cloud.
I mean, yeah, just kind of multiple copies everywhere, I guess.
Everywhere.
I mean, not everywhere, sorry, but in like secure places.
So we want to identify, okay, we have an alternative headquarters site. Maybe we have a copy there. Maybe there are certain key personnel that have a safe in their home that have it there in case they need it, right? So we want to identify, even in this impact scenario of, okay, if that happened, would anybody be able to access this documentation, right? So part of that process is making sure that your step-by-steps are going to be accessible given what the different type of disasters are. And then we want to do planning, disaster recovery planning, and actually know that it's going to work. So one way you could do disaster recovery planning is to say, all right, let's take a Saturday and let's sit in our conference room and let's pretend, right? Let's hash this out, let's role play that there is a disaster and we're going to go through this process and make sure it's going to work. Is that a good idea to do that?
Great idea. Now dealing with management plans and, compensation for full-time.
Yeah, so we have to get people, maybe everyone's on salary, but at the end of the day, they're working on Saturday, so we've got to make sure we're taking care of the fact that they're on Saturday. But is role playing it out going to tell us that it's going to work? It won't be exact. At some level, it will help, right? And we'll be able to say, okay, we're missing some things. We didn't think about this. Let's go back. But what will be even better than role playing out of disaster recovery plan? Rehearsal, right? At 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, the power gets shut down to the building. We're going to assume it's because a tornado came through and took out our power supply. Now let's go through the process of what we would do, assuming that was a tornado, right? The best way to know if it's going to work is to actually do it. How many of you are growing up, had your parents wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning and say fire drill? A couple people, most are like, no, Dad never did that to me. But the whole idea of that, I mean, how many in elementary school had to duck under your desks or actually do a fire drill? The whole idea is, in the case of a disaster, you would actually know what to do as opposed to go, what does that alarm mean? Is it time for recess? I've not heard that one. Practicing it means you're more apt to get it right. And in the case of an organization with a disaster recovery plan, one of the important things is to know ahead of time that you've thought of all the things that will actually need to happen, and the people know how to do that. Because it's one thing, let's assume that you're a database administrator. How many of you taken a database class? Few people. Let's assume that your job is to do a particular task that you only ever have to do if there is a disaster. Let's say it's restore the database from backup. Those of you who've taken a database class, when's the last time you restored a database from backup? Have you ever done it? Okay. In theory, I have a set of commands, and I kind of sort of know, do I know if my backups are good? You've never tested them, you don't know if you're actually getting good backups. Do I know that I can actually do it? Right? If you actually have to do it and you do that once a year or something as part of a practice routine, then if disaster happens, you know what you're doing. The other thing that can oftentimes happen in an organization is personnel change from the last time you practiced it till now. So if you aren't doing these things on an annual cadence at some level, you actually have new people in place that are like, oh yeah, I can do it, right? But until they actually have to do it, there might be aspects of it they don't know. So one of the decisions you have to make as an organization as you're doing these is, where do I put backup material, right? You can take the approach of, I'm going to have a hot site. I'm going to have another site that has everything I need in place. It has the environmental, the air conditioning, the power, all those things, the hardware, the software, the computers, the servers, basically a copy of what it is that I'm going to back up. And the great thing about a hot site is if something happens, flip a switch, you can be back up in the same day, right? It's not as quick as snap a finger, pretty darn close, right? You can back up usually within hours. But what's the downside to having a hot site? It's expensive, right? Can you imagine if you've got, 500 computers that are up and ready to go, and you're paying for air conditioning in an office that can hold 500 people, and you're only ever using that if that inevitable disaster comes into place? Some people need hot sites, right? But a lot of people don't because of the cost, and I will say that there's a different type of site that we'll talk about in a second that'll probably be better. A warm site has the basics in place. The hardware's there. We're gonna have to go and get a few things. A warm site we can usually get up in less than a week. But we might be down for a few days to get those in place. A cold site is basically, I have a location, I have the shell of a place, but I'm gonna have to go out and get computers and so forth and put the infrastructure in place. This could take a lot longer. Cold sites are becoming even more problematic because of the supply chain issues that we've been experiencing over the last 2 or 3 years. It becomes really hard to get a lot of computer material very quickly right now. So this is even more difficult. A mobile site would be the whole idea of bringing a trailer in that becomes the headquarters that you can drag into place that could be turned on. Usually it's a hot or a warm site. But most organizations today, I believe, use what I refer to as a hybrid site. Right? So ExxonMobil, for example, let's talk about WSU. WSU. If something happens in Pullman that would be, for whatever reason, affect the WSU system from doing the administrative pieces of things, not just the teaching of the classes. If something happened and we couldn't administer WSU from here, where else could WSU administer things? Tri-Cities, Vancouver, Everett, Spokane. Our infrastructure people are there every day. A lot of stuff gets backed up to a cloud service somewhere. And you don't have to be in Pullman to administer the WSU system. I mean, most of WSU is in Pullman, so it makes sense that a lot of the administration stuff happens here. But if things went really south, you could do that from somewhere else. Same is true for most organizations, right? You don't actually have to be in the headquarters anymore because the servers aren't necessarily in the basement like they've been for years, right? A lot of the server infrastructure is being outsourced to others. So you can rely on the fact that you don't have to pay for a hot site. You just have to have a plan in place that says, you know what, if something goes really bad in Houston, that office we have in Chicago gets turned on, because the odds that something bad is happening in Chicago at the same time it's happening in Houston are probably quite low, right? So you have these alternative sites you're already using anyways that take on those administrative responsibilities. But having that defined, knowing when to do that and what that's going to look like is important. All right. Covered a lot of stuff today. Questions, comments about what we've talked about? If not, I've got questions for you, but I'll let you guys pause here. Bring up questions you might have.
Before you went, WSU,
Yeah.
it said another instance,
Yeah, ExxonMobil is what I was talking about.
what is on that? What, can you elaborate on that?
So
I guess you would say they would have
yeah, so ExxonMobil, I do not know where their alternative headquarters are, but in that perspective, I would say Exxon does a whole lot more and has people stationed in more places than just in that Houston area. So wherever those people are, they would have someone who says, okay, we've got a disaster. We know that Houston's not going to be a good place for these administrative decisions. We're going to turn over, maybe even fly some key personnel to the Chicago office or wherever those alternative people are at. And that way they're in position to where they're not in the midst of the 51 inches of rain that we're expecting in 3 days of that hurricane, to be able to keep the organization going, making those decisions that are going to help things. A company like ExxonMobil, they probably, one of their first things that they're paying attention to is all of their platforms where they're drilling for oil, right? Are they going to leave their people on those platforms when they know a terrible storm's coming in place? But the very first thing they're probably going to do is recognize that's a problem and say, you know what, guys, we're shutting down those platforms. Everyone's coming in because it's not worth losing life over the risk of something bad's going to happen, right? That's the whole idea of prioritizing personnel. At the same time, the people in Houston, even if I could get to the office, let's assume I'm an IT manager of some sort. If I'm worried about the fact that my wife and kids are at home having to sandbag their house and keep the house from whatever, do we want to make me come to work? Maybe our headquarters is on a hill, we can get there. So if I'm worried about what's going on with my wife and kids at home, I need to be thinking about that from an organization perspective. Who are those that absolutely have to? There may be some people that do absolutely have to, but to be cognizant of that and make those decisions ahead of time, as opposed to, hey, boss, I'm not coming in. Things are going sideways in my house and I got to be here to take care of it. We want to kind of assess that and know that before we get to the point where, the 5 people who need to be present can't even get there, can't be there, and we've planned ahead for those sorts of things. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that WSU, when COVID came out, didn't have a plan for a global pandemic.
Yep.
So how do you decide which extreme scenarios to plan for? Should WSU prepare for nuclear war or a meteor strike? Where do you cut it off at? I think
That's a good question. I think it's gonna be different for every organization, because you can always go to the extreme of not doing the planning for the things that they could happen. I think what you do is you look at what's the likelihood of any of these sorts of things happening, and a lot of what you would do would be the same, right? So a nuclear attack, I would ask, or war, right? I mean, what happens if war is brought to the homeland, right? What begins to happen? How do we provide protection for people? I think you begin to categorize those under some more blanket sorts of things. You don't have to be so specific that it is, what happens if something happens and we just can't be at WSU? We can't be on campus. What do we do to ensure that the education endeavor still happens? And a lot of things could fall into that category of we couldn't be at WSU. And then, if there's nuclear fallout and all those sorts of things, that becomes a whole different deal. So I think you can probably, a lot of people probably wouldn't have said a pandemic that, takes over the world was even on the radar of things. But the whole idea that we can't deliver campus or courses on campus for a period of time, that same thing could happen if there was a giant fire that burned 10 buildings or, took out all the classroom spaces or so forth, right? So I think that a lot of that is covered under, remote delivery of coursework and so forth. That an event happens that prevents those things from happening. Yeah, good question. But yeah, beginning to think at a slightly higher level than the absolute individual thing that can happen, unless you're in a place like Houston, where a hurricane happens often enough that this is something we have to plan for. Does WSU need to plan for hurricanes? Why not? Because it's never happened. And I think that part of that is, a nuclear explosion has never happened. So some of those things, again, you begin to put those into the same box of an event that makes delivery of classes on campus impossible. So, yeah, other questions? All right, well, I will go ahead and wrap up by saying thank you. I think you guys have, about a 15-minute break, Bernie?
15-minute break till 10:45.
So,
And that will,
awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. It was fun. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did.